the first thing I want to know, well, actually, let me back up a second. There's something on your website on your About page that I read that I thought was really great and makes you kind of the perfect person to answer this question. You said, I sit at the intersection of several communities, which gives me a 360-degree view of the changes now shaping writing and publishing. People working inside the industry see me as an expert in digital and self-publishing, while independent authors see me as a traditional publishing figure. So the obvious question becomes, how do writers decide whether they should pursue a traditional publisher or whether they should self-publish? Let's start there. And then I'm going to follow up with some stats about what actually people can expect when they go either route. But so where do they start? How do they decide whether they should try to self-publish or get a publisher?
Well, first I'll be honest, which is sometimes you don't have a choice between the two because it's not easy to get a traditional publisher on board. Traditional publishing means you're getting paid in advance. The publisher is undertaking all financial risk. And it also takes just a lot of time that some people aren't willing to put in. Now, the reason you might go to the trouble of trying to get a traditional publisher interested is that if you really want nationwide distribution to, retail outlets, to brick and mortar,
Mhm.
publishers can do that. If you want attention from the mainstream media, if you want to try for national media coverage, a book publisher, a traditional publisher has those connections in place, and it helps open doors when you have them
Mhm.
on board. And personally, if I'm working with a traditional publisher, I really want an editor who's going to take my work to the next level. It's difficult to do that all by yourself, even if you're hiring a freelancer. Usually the editor at the publishing house is hugely invested in seeing you and your work succeed. And it's hard to buy that on a freelance basis. And then I'll mention, some people want a traditional publisher for the prestige or the status
Mhm.
that it can confer, depending on what sort of publisher we're talking about. But I don't think that's a great reason, actually,
Mhm.
unless you know how to harness that for your own end, that that it's going to open those doors that I mentioned. So on the flip side, with self-publishing, it's great when you want absolute control. So you
Mhm.
want control over the package, the pricing, the title, the cover, when it's going to release. Traditional publishing takes about 1 to 3 years on average from beginning to end. Some people don't realize how slow it actually
Yeah.
is. So if speed is of the essence, then self-publishing is the way to go.
I would
Um,
imagine that speed part also is a huge component depending on what kind of book you're writing, right? How
right.
how how timeless is it? If
Yeah.
are you writing about something that 3 years from now, the world's gonna be in a completely different place by the time it comes out?
Exactly. Yeah. So if you want to write a book on NFTs, I don't know that I would go the traditional
Right.
publishing route.
Right. Do you think, you mentioned that some of that decision is obviously made by necessity, right? It's easy to say, oh, I'm going to go the traditional publisher route, but if nobody wants you're not going to go the traditional publisher route. Do you think, is it getting increasingly harder and more difficult to get a traditional publisher? I mean, it's never been easy, but what's that trajectory like these days?
I think there's more competition than ever, and authors are more capable than ever. Like there's just so many more resources and places to learn how to improve your writing that didn't exist when I first
Mhm.
got into the industry. Like there's the internet now
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
so I think while the same number of books, more books really are being published by traditional houses, it can be hard to get them to take on your work because they're also focused on things like platform, some sort of evidence that you're already doing well in the market.
Mhm.
So there are just all of these different factors that come into play today that might not have, they wouldn't have been a factor, let's say in the 90s or before that.
Well, I was gonna say that's the irony, right? The less you need a traditional publisher, the more the traditional publisher wants you, right?
Yes, that's
I I,
exactly
I
true.
assume, and it's funny because I used to work in the comedy industry, and it was the same way, right? It was like, well, the more you were able to sell tickets to your own show, the more interested the comedy club or the venue was in booking you because it's like, well, you can sell, you can bring your own audience to it. So let's get into a little bit well, actually, before I get into the numbers, let's talk about genre as relates to this question. Are there certain genres that in general you're better off going the self-publishing route or better off going the traditional publishing route? How does that play out?
When you look at the self-publishing authors who are really succeeding and like making six figures, they're generally writing commercial fiction and in very particular genres. So, like science fiction, fantasy, mystery, thriller, suspense, romance is the biggest by far.
Hmm.
Now, there are nonfiction authors who do very well self-publishing, but when you look at, where the discussions are happening in the communities surrounding self-publishing, it tends to be fiction oriented
Why do you think that is?
because there's such huge voracious reader demand
Hmm.
for commercial fiction. Like there are readers who will consume several books a week in their favorite
Hmm.
genre. And so it's like there are people who write commercial fiction and self-publish it will typically produce multiple titles per year. I mean, they really treat it like a job and it's
Hmm.
feeding that demand. And there are also platforms in place like Amazon Kindle is the big one where people go there to find their next read. And with
Hmm.
nonfiction, it tends to be more platform driven and people have this specific problem that they're facing. And there's a lot of free information out there. And you may choose to solve your problem not through a book, but through a course or a YouTube
Right.
video or a podcast.
Do you feel like with nonfiction, if I wanted to go, let's just say, and this is a complete hypothetical, I'm not doing this, but let's say I wanted to write a nonfiction book. I wanted to go the traditional publisher route. Does it need to be, as far as sort of niche or topic goes, does it need to be broad enough, sufficiently broad to get a publisher interested, right? So for example, let's say I was like, I want to write a book about how to create a great newsletter. Will a traditional publisher look at that and go, that might be a big niche, but for us, it's kind of too small a niche. We'd rather have, you compare that, and obviously it's like comparing it to Grand Slam, but like you compare that to James Clear, who's writing about habits, and it's like that's a much broader audience than newsletter. How important is sort of being broad enough if you want to go the traditional publishing
Well, the frustrating answer is it depends. It depends on the size of the publisher. So
route?
James
Okay.
Clear is with one of the really big New York
Hmm.
houses that they do tend to like the books that they feel like can break out on a national level, like
Hmm.
Atomic Habits. But there are other publishers that really go deep in a very particular niche or community. Like there are tech publishers, like O'Reilly would be a
Hmm.
classic example. And they're not afraid to get into the minutia of those communities and they will publish books on very fine, narrow topics. So it kind of depends on what sort of publisher you're going after. That said, I do think a general challenge for nonfiction authors is that they try to make their book for everyone or anyone. And publishers don't really like that. They want to see that, you have a voice or a style that's really targeting a specific type of reader.
Yeah. So talk to me about, that's a great point about the sort of smaller publishers. Cause even me, it's like, I don't really think about like, well, yeah, but there's all these other smaller publishers that even saying going the traditional publishing route doesn't necessarily mean massive, huge publisher.
Right.
Talk to me a little bit. And I know the answer to this is also going to be, it depends, but talk to me a little bit in general about the financial aspect of this. In general, what can people expect? And I'm not talking about you're a best-selling author, or I'm not talking about James Clear's next book, but let's say it's like you're a first-time author and you're lucky enough to maybe get an offer from a traditional publisher, or you might self-publish it. What do kind of the economics realistically look like in terms of what you could expect to get either as an advance or royalties, or kind of what's the money piece of this? Yeah.
It's probably similar. So there's this statistic that gets repeated again and again in many different ways, and it comes from BookScan, which
Mhm.
tracks print book sales in the United States. And the statistic is always similar wherever it gets regurgitated. Somewhere around 90% of books published each year don't sell more than 2,000 copies.
Mhm.
And people are like, oh my God.
And
What's
that counts traditional and self-published?
It's I would say that's an average of traditional publishing for the most
Gotcha.
part, or books that get ISBN numbers, which is kind of the
Okay.
official way we track books,
Right.
but mostly traditional. So if
Mhm.
you were to lump in like the more than 1 million titles that are
Right,
published
that
every
number's going
year.
down,
uh,
it's not going up. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, often publishers, traditional publishers don't expect your advance to be earned out like 80% of
Mhm.
books. don't earn out their advance. You never see a royalty check. And the average advance isn't that big. Like even the big
Mhm.
houses aren't regularly paying out of the five figures for most of the titles that they take
Yeah.
on. I would say if you're a known fiction author, but you have a really great book idea and you have some sort of a following, $20,000, maybe
Mhm.
$50,000 if you're doing really well for an advance.
Mhm.
Fiction, it tends to go lower, four figures for a book.
Right.
But again, there are lots of variables. I'm
Yeah.
trying to reduce people's expectations so you
Right.
will not
Right.
be disappointed.
Right. Right. With a publisher knowing that, like you said, 80% of them, they're not going to earn that advance back. Are they doing it just hoping that sort of they'll find the hits and the hits will pay for the
Hmm.
misses?
Yeah.
Or are they also with a sort of newer author placing a bet and going like, okay, like the first one's probably not going to earn back, but this person's talented. And I think we want to be in
Right.
business with them and we'll get there. Or is it a combination of the two?
I mean, unfortunately, it's mostly the first where
Yeah.
they're just throwing things at the wall. Let's see what
They're playing
sticks.
roulette. They're
Yeah,
placing bets and hoping
exactly.
something hits.
That's exactly right. Now, one hopes that there's some of the latter, that there's some of it that's investment in the long term, but that the biggest publishers are not known for doing that.
Right. You mean big media companies don't think long term? Shocking. Great. Okay. Well, that's all super helpful.